1979, Afghanistan. Soviet troops invade an Islamic nation. A call for jihad against the infidel sounds throughout the Muslim world. A call raised by men like Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric. Charismatic and deeply spiritual, he is the man who would mentor and shape Osama bin Laden throughout much of the 1980s.
My name is Hudayfa Azzam. I've been living with bin Laden for more than 8 years continuously, you could say.
Hudayfa is Abdullah Azzam's son. This is his first interview for Western television.
My father was teaching Islamic and Arabic studies, and Osama bin Laden was studying engineering that time.
Bin Laden was drawn to the influential cleric seen here in Afghanistan. He was the ideological force behind the call for jihad, and he implored the young and impressionable Osama to follow him.
At the end of 1984, in the summer, my father told him, "You have to leave with me. I'm leaving to Pakistan and Afghanistan."
Bin Laden responded. He made the move from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan.
People called me Abdullah Anas. I remember I met Osama in 1984 in Abdullah Azzam's house in Islamabad.
Anas was one of many Arab Muslims recruited by Abdullah Azzam to wage jihad in Afghanistan. He is seen here with Azzam and two of his sons, Ibrahim and Hudayfa.
Sheikh Abdullah was the father figure of all of us. You can't imagine how he loved Osama bin Laden.
The picture you get of bin Laden at this point in his life, he's shy, he's retiring, he's monosyllabic, people barely get a word out of him. And he's completely overshadowed by his mentor, Abdullah Azzam, who's a larger-than-life, charismatic figure, and somebody who really had a father-son relationship with bin Laden.
I traveled here to the city of Peshawar, Pakistan, on the border with Afghanistan, to find out more about bin Laden and his mentor, Abdullah Azzam. Peshawar is a perfect gateway for Mujahideen, those holy warriors who came to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
You can find arms, you can buy Kalashnikov, you can sell it. It's an open area, completely open area.
It was in this neighborhood that Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam set up the headquarters of an organization they called the Services Bureau. It was to assist Muslim fighters heading into Afghanistan and also Afghan refugees fleeing the Soviet army. The Services Bureau was run by Azzam. Osama bin Laden was the financier, donating some of his own fortune and the money he collected from other wealthy Saudis. One of these houses, we're told, used to be a guest house where the recruits would come before entering Afghanistan. They'd be given weapons and clothing, as well as military and ideological training. Bin Laden himself trained at one of the camps.
The training on weapons and how to use weapons, how to fight, how to join the battles together as we were with bin Laden, yes.
Bin Laden's time in the shadow of his mentor, Abdullah Azzam, would be short-lived. No longer content to merely fund the fight, bin Laden yearned to join it. His countless hours and days in the harsh Saudi desert, without shelter and with few provisions, had prepared him for this moment. It was always his belief that he was destined to be a holy warrior.
I think he's always modeled himself on the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad was not only a great religious figure, but was also somebody who personally battled the infidels. And so for bin Laden, it would have been important to continue in the Prophet Muhammad's footsteps.
Several years on the battlefield would harden bin Laden. Mohammed bin Laden's shy and reticent young son Osama was now ready to command his own all-Arab army in Afghanistan.
Osama started to think about gathering all Arabs as much as he can and put them in one camp, in one front.
Bin Laden decided to create this all-Arab army because the young Arabs he was recruiting were willing to martyr themselves, willing to take incredible personal risk. And it was this group of people that Bin Laden molded to take on the Soviets directly.
Their first test was the Battle of Jaji in the spring of 1987. Hutaifa Azam fought alongside bin Laden, who was suffering from low blood pressure in the thin mountain air.
It was a very, very hard battle. And he joined the battle while he was ill, and he was having this low pressure, and my father told him to take rest, but he refuses. And he joined the battle for more than 4 days.
The Russians fell back. Jaji was the first victory for bin Laden's Arab army.
It was not a particularly significant moment in the Afghan war. But from a psychological point of view, it was really the beginning of sort of bin Laden's almost mythic persona, because a group of Arabs had held off the Soviets, and it was, you know, it got a lot of play in the Middle East.
Bin Laden was now hailed as a fearless leader, a hero on the front lines of jihad.
He's brave and he's ready to give his life. He's not a coward.
I visited the site of that battle with him in Jaji.
Bin Laden invited journalist Jamal Khashoggi to Afghanistan. It was a bit of PR in his new campaign to become Osama the general, the beginning of his media strategy to draw attention to himself and his message, a skill he would come to perfect. Khashoggi took this picture, he says the first one ever published of bin Laden. So for Osama, Jaji was a recruiting tool.
It was a recruiting tool. It was the start of having an independent front where he became the Amir, the leader of those Arab mujahideen who are gathered around him.
وقد استفدت استفادة عظيمة في الجهاد في أفغانستان كان من المتعذر أن أحصل عليها في أي فرصة أخرى.
In 1988, the Soviets, worn down and demoralized, began to withdraw from Afghanistan. And bin Laden, now battle-hardened, returned to Peshawar, a holy warrior without a war. But this man would soon change that. Ayman al-Zawahiri.
We are Muslims who believed in their religion.
A radical Egyptian who would give bin Laden the enemy he was looking for. Fighters, all smiles after the Battle of Jaji. The Soviets, the infidels, were repelled. In 1988, Osama bin Laden emerged the hero. His exploits on this Afghan battlefield were immortalized in Jihad magazine, published by bin Laden himself and his longtime mentor, Abdullah Azam. The Battle of Jaji made bin Laden, and he was happy to exploit his newfound fame.
Everybody said that he won the battle in Jaji. Newspapers, magazines, everybody is talking about it. He became a hero.
Bin Laden's soaring confidence and abundant wealth would soon attract those looking to exploit this rising star. Militants like Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian doctor. Zawahiri had spent 3 years in Egypt's notorious prisons for his jihadist activities.
We want to speak to the whole world.
Embittered after years of torture at the hands of the Egyptian government,
Why did they bring us here?
Zawahiri was determined to overthrow the secular regimes of the Middle East. His was not a battle for a piece of land. He wanted an Islamic world without borders.
We are Muslims. We are Muslims who believed in their religion.
Two divergent influences, one old, one new. This is how bin Laden's transformation began, from warrior to extremist.
Bin Laden was increasingly being influenced by Egyptian militants around in his circle who were saying, let's overthrow all these secular governments in the Middle East.
Armed with a radical new ideology, bin Laden was ready to step out from behind Azam, ready to lead his army onto the next war. And that army would take shape here in Peshawar, Pakistan, in this neighborhood where Osama bin Laden lived. Meetings were held, plans were made. This is where Al-Qaeda was born. And these are the actual minutes of those first meetings, a written record of the creation of an organization called Al-Qaeda, or the base. These notes, obtained by CNN, are seen here for the first time on television.
When Al-Qaeda was founded, there was no thought of attacking the United States. That would come much, much later. The program was really about training people for jihads outside Afghanistan.
The minutes list bin Laden and the other attendees. There were strict requirements to join Al-Qaeda, some surprising ones. They must, for example, have good manners and good references, and they must recite an oath to listen and obey the superiors. In Al-Qaeda's structure and flowchart, bin Laden showed that he was his father's son.
Bin Laden comes out of a business background. His father was one of the most successful businessmen in the Middle East. Bin Laden himself studied economics at university. So he modeled Al-Qaeda in a rather sort of, on a business model. He was sort of the CEO. There were committees for military affairs, religious affairs, financial affairs, and media affairs.
Al-Qaeda made members sign an employment contract. There was a benefits package, vacations home, complete with round-trip airline tickets. Vacation requests had to be submitted 2.5 months before the travel date. Recruits were soon put to the test. In February 1989, the Soviets, in the last stages of their withdrawal, left behind a puppet Afghan communist government. For Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, victory in Afghanistan was not yet complete. They joined the battle against the Afghan communists in Jalalabad, near the Pakistan border.
My name is Edward Giradeh, and I first met Osama bin Laden in 1989 in Kunar province of Afghanistan.
Giradeh, a British journalist, was covering the Battle of Jalalabad. He remembers a chance but chilling encounter with bin Laden during the fighting.
We arrived at the front line, then suddenly this very tall Arab came up to me, walked up, and said, what are you doing here? And he said, but this is the jihad, and you have absolutely no right to be here, and you should leave.
Giradeh had never heard of bin Laden, but for the next 45 minutes, the mysterious Arab warrior spoke in English. Religion was the topic of discussion.
And then, as our conversation came to an end, I reached out my hand to bid goodbye, and he said, I can shake your hand. And as I turned away, he said, if I see you again, I'll kill you.
Shortly after the battle, bin Laden returned home to Saudi Arabia.
My name is Turki Al-Faisal. I met Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 1985.
Prince Turki Al-Faisal was the head of Saudi Arabia's intelligence service. He told me that in 1990, bin Laden offered up his army to drive out the communists from neighboring Yemen. But the Saudis didn't take him seriously. What was your response when he said that he wanted to do that?
My response to him was that this is not the right time, and that military conflict in the South Yemen was not advisable at that time.
Later that year, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, bin Laden once again offered his troops to the Saudis.
He asked other officials in the kingdom for the opportunity again to bring his mujahideen, as he called them, to drive out Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And again he was told that that was not the right thing to do.
Instead, the Saudis turned to the West for help. The US led a multinational coalition with hundreds of thousands of American troops in the land of the two holiest places, Mecca and Medina. To bin Laden, it was sacrilege. He began to voice his outrage. When the Saudis tried to muzzle him, bin Laden fled the kingdom, a man without a country, A man on the run. A man racing to a point of no return. September 11th, 2001. Across from Saudi Arabia, across the Red Sea, lies the nation of Sudan. Its capital, Khartoum, an ancient African crossroad. It was here in the early 1990s that a radical Muslim government hell-bent on creating a pure Islamist state opened its doors to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
In 1991-92, bin Laden is a man without a country, and he decides to go to Sudan because there is a government which has recently come into power which is sympathetic to his view, and he believes that he can help create some kind of Islamic utopia.
An Islamic utopia that bin Laden set out to build from this, his new home in Khartoum. Here, he quickly started an array of businesses. Bin Laden wasn't looking to foster the persona of an international terrorist.
He wanted to show that he was a businessman, and he was a legitimate businessman. My name is Scott McLeod. I met Osama bin Laden in Sudan in 1996. It struck me that he was very calm, serene, almost like a holy man.
Though he'd been forced to flee Saudi Arabia for speaking out against the government and US troops in the kingdom, in the early 90s there were very few in US law enforcement who knew of Osama bin Laden.
At that point in time, and particularly from the FBI, he hadn't attracted a great deal of attention.
That would change. At 12:18 p.m. on February 26, 1993, the World Trade Center, an icon of American economic power, was attacked by a powerful truck bomb. The nation was in shock as it watched live coverage of the chaos around the Twin Towers. For years, Americans had watched news footage of the aftermath of terrorism abroad, but this was different. This was an attack on the homeland. The manhunts that followed would eventually lead to the arrests and convictions of two men with suspected links to bin Laden, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the World Trade Center bombing.
لا أعرف رمزي يوسف وليس بصحيح الكلام الذي تتناقله الحكومة الأمريكية.
Bin Laden has denied knowing Ramzi Youssef. But in the larger sense, bin Laden really was responsible because Ramzi Youssef had trained at an Al-Qaeda training camp, and Ramzi Youssef's uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, would become the guy who went to bin Laden in '96 with the beginnings of what would turn out to be the plan for 9/11 itself.
Bin Laden may deny knowing Ramzi Youssef, but there is no denying the influence of Omar Abdul Rahman, a radical Egyptian cleric who preached at this Jersey City mosque across from the World Trade Center. Rahman, also known as the Blind Sheikh, was the spiritual guide of the Trade Center bombers and would ultimately become the theological force behind Al-Qaeda.
To the extent that there is a spiritual guide to Al-Qaeda, I think it's Sheikh Rahman, because he is the spiritual influence of the Egyptians in Al-Qaeda, and the Egyptians are so important for the group ideologically and also personally.
Bin Laden's relationship with the Egyptian militants surrounding him, in particular Ayman al-Zawahiri, intensified in Sudan. Journalist Jamal Khashoggi met with bin Laden a number of times during this period.
I felt the presence of the Egyptian radicals. They were there, physically they were there. They would not sit with me. We were in his garden, sitting on the floor talking, when somebody came and whispered something in his ear. I couldn't comprehend what they were saying, but I picked up the Egyptian slang there. They were there.
By 1995, the Saudi government had frozen bin Laden's assets and stripped him of his citizenship.
فأرسلوا إلي أخواني ووالدتي وعمي فيما يقارب 9 زيارات إلى الخرطوم من أجل التوقف والرجوع إلى المملكة معتذرا للملك فهد، ولكني اعتذرت لهم بلطف وأعلم أنهم
Bin Laden let his true feelings be known in this, an open letter to King Fahd. In it, he condemned the Saudi royal family, calling them corrupt. He also called for a campaign of attacks to drive US forces out of the kingdom. Bin Laden's words were heard. Not long after his decree, a terrorist car bomb ripped through a joint US-Saudi military facility in Riyadh, killing 5 Americans.
A car bomb exploded in front of a National Guard training center in Riyadh. And the perpetrators were captured, and they said that they had been inspired by bin Laden.
The Saudi royal family and the Clinton administration had seen enough. Both stepped up pressure on the Sudanese government to expel bin Laden, who by this time was out of money and knew his days were numbered in Khartoum. He had already survived at least 1 assassination attempt.
I was sitting in another guest house in Khartoum when I heard after sunset that there is a clash, and they attacked the guest house of Usama in order to kill him.
Under fire and feeling the heat, Osama bin Laden and his followers take flight again. In May of 1996, bin Laden returns to where his holy war began, the troubled lands that would spawn the unthinkable.
We know that bin Laden's responsible for 9/11, but in the last 5 years, the United States has not been able to catch him.